A cool breeze blew through the open windows into the classroom, sending a refreshing sensation through the warm afternoon air. Only 10 more minutes until the end of the school day, and Lincoln could go home and read comics in his underwear and play video games. He was happy that, as a kid, all he had to worry about was taking out the trash and sometimes his sisters bickering. Mrs. Johnson went on with her lesson, but the class couldn't have cared less. It was Friday, and there was only a few minutes left in the school day, and once the bell rang, learning would be the last thing they would care about. They all looked forward to the innocent weekend activities that would envelop the next 2 days until they were sent back to the daily routine of school. That's what being a kid was about. School, homework, chores, and then what little time was left was used for fun. The clock ticked away, and the little hand was almost on the 3. Lincoln looked outside and watched the trees dance in the wind as he thought of all the fun activities he could do outside. Although he and his sisters weren't allowed outside after dark because recently, a few kids in and around Royal Woods, Michigan, had gone missing. The police suggested a serial kidnapper. Lincoln quickly pushed that thought out of his mind as he turned his attention towards the sky. There was hardly a cloud in sight. Maybe he could fly a kite. That was the last pure thought he'd ever have, because as soon as he thought that, he noticed a glowing speck in the sky that eventually grew bigger and bigger. What could that be? He thought. The shape continued to grow, and Lincoln suddenly noticed a streak that followed it. That's when he was hit with the realization that this thing looked exactly like a meteor. Lincoln watched as it came closer and closer. It was heading right towards them. The meteor then caused the entire sky to light up even brighter than it already was. Everyone in the classroom turned and looked out the windows. "Look out!" Lincoln shouted as he dove to the floor. As soon as he hit the ground, a loud bang filled the air, and a shock wave caused the window glass to shatter and knocked all the kids off their seats. Screams of fright filled the room as soon as that happened. And then, silence. Lincoln continued to lie on the ground with his face down until his ears stopped ringing. Then he slowly poked his head over his desk. He heard some kids crying and noticed that all the lights in the room were off. What happened? He thought. The meteor just exploded before it hit the ground. Could that happen? He continued to ponder. Lisa would know the answer. Lisa, Lincoln said to himself. He suddenly worried about his sisters. Were they okay? The entire class soon got to their feet. They all looked to where their teacher was just standing, waiting. She lay on the floor as well. The students waited for her to get up, but she continued to lay face down on the ground. Mrs. Johnson? Someone said. No response. They all just stood in place. Lincoln eventually shot a glance over to where his best friend Clyde was standing. He looked at Lincoln and they exchanged worried glances. Eventually, Mrs. Johnson shifted and mumbled something. She's awake, someone said. They all hurried and surrounded her, waiting for her to get up on her own. She shifted to her side, revealing a strange, angry, scowling face. The entire class continued to stare at her in bewilderment until a girl said the teacher's name again. The teacher quickly turned towards the girl and sprung at the poor defenseless child. The girl barely had time to scream before the teacher chomped down on her left cheek. The entire class screamed. A lot of students ran out of the room, while others just stood frozen in place. Lincoln and Clyde looked at each other again, and this time their faces both showed pure fear. Eventually, a big kid went up, grabbed the feral teacher by the waist, and began to pull her off the girl. A bunch of kids continued to stand and scream at the terrifying sight. Lincoln suddenly rushed behind Mrs. Johnson and began to pull as well. This instigated Clyde to help too. Lincoln and Clyde weren't that strong, but they were forceful enough to begin to pry their teacher off the kid. As they tugged, the teacher still had her teeth clamped down on the girl's cheek. Eventually, they were beginning to make progress in pulling their rabid teacher off the girl, but as they did, her teeth ripped a chunk from the girl's cheek. Even more kids ran out of the room at the sight of this. They successfully pulled their teacher off the girl, and the student helped her up, and they both ran out of the room with the girl covering her bloody cheek with her hand. Once they were out, only Lincoln, Clyde, the big kid, and 3 other kids remained. The teacher broke free of their grasp and quickly turned herself towards them and threw herself at Lincoln. Lincoln put his arms out to block the teacher as she tackled him to the ground. "Lincoln!" Clyde cried, as he and the remaining students sprang to help Lincoln. They all lifted her off Lincoln, and then they shoved her as hard as they could, causing her to fall backwards and bang her head on the corner of her desk. They all stood around their teacher as she lay still on the ground. Blood began to drool out of the gash caused by hitting her desk, and she was eventually surrounded by a pool of her own blood. One of the kids cussed as they all looked at each other, wondering what to do now. Clyde spoke up. We need to go tell Principal Huggins, or a teacher, or..." A scream coming from the hallways grabbed their attention. They all ran out to see that the halls were filled with absolute pandemonium. All the teachers were attacking every kid in sight. Lincoln and the remaining kids were transfixed on the chaos until one of the adults noticed them and ran at them at full speed. They all screamed and slammed the door. The adult crashed a hand through the little window on the door and grabbed one of the kids. He screamed as the adult pulled him closer to the door. The adult tried to bite him, but he couldn't stick his head through the window. 3 of the kids tried to help him, while Lincoln and Clyde both scrambled towards the desks so they could shove them towards the door to use as barricades. As they did that, the kid continued to scream as the teacher tried to drag him closer towards his mouth. Lincoln and Clyde tried to shove the desks up against the door, but the kid obstructed their path. Lincoln searched desperately for a way to fend off the adult, but the only thing they had were pencils. They would have to do. Lincoln told Clyde to grab as many pencils as he could hold in one hand, and as soon as they gathered up all they could, they both ran and drove the pencils into the man's arm. He hardly reacted. Lincoln wondered why the man didn't let go. Could he even feel pain? They all then grabbed at the man's arm and pulled it against the window frame until they heard the bone in the man's arm snap. The grown-up lost his grip and the kid fell away from him. That's when Lincoln and Clyde quickly pushed the desks against the door, and then the other kids joined them in piling the desks until they used up all the desks in the room. Once they did that, there was finally a moment to breathe. And breathe they did, because Clyde began to hyperventilate. "What the heck is going on?" he yelled through gasped breaths. "I don't know," said Lincoln, who was trying his best to calm his friend down. "This is messed up, man," one of the kids said. "I need to get out of here." He scurried to the windows and vaulted out one of the broken ones. The other 3 kids soon did the same thing, leaving Lincoln and Clyde alone in the room with the body of what used to be their teacher. "What are we going to do, Lincoln?" Clyde cried as he continued to breathe heavily. He then collapsed to a sitting position. Lincoln went and retrieved Clyde's inhaler. Clyde soon calmed down, but the hallway did not. The man outside continued to beat at the door with his unbroken arm. "Clyde, we need to get out of here," Lincoln said urgently, pointing towards the windows. "I don't want to go out there, Lincoln," Clyde begged. "We have no choice," Lincoln responded as he helped his friend to his feet. "That door won't hold forever, and we can't stay here." Clyde knew that Lincoln was right, but he was still hesitant. Lincoln assured him that he had his back, and with that, they both went over to the window and braced themselves for the carnage that they were most likely going to witness outside. Lincoln and Clyde were greeted by the warm air as they hopped out the window and rushed as fast as they could away from the school. The cool wind was but a slight relief to their flushed faces. They were almost to the street when Lincoln skidded to a halt. Clyde noticed this. "What's wrong, Lincoln?" Clyde asked worriedly. "My sisters. They might still be in there." Fear spread over Clyde's face. As much as going back in there was the last thing he wanted to do, he knew there was no way he was going to let his best friend go back in alone. They both ran to the front of the school, where the doors were in constant motion from kids running out. All of them had the same look of fear and confusion as they ran past Lincoln and Clyde. Lincoln turned to Clyde and told him that he didn't have to do this, that he could continue on to his own house, but Clyde's mind was made up. He was always going to have Lincoln's back. Lincoln nodded to his friend, and they both rushed into the building. They bumped past several kids who wailed as they ran past them. Lincoln and Clyde paid them little mind until they noticed a girl running right to them who was being chased by an adult. They recognized the girl as one of their classmates, Molly. Behind her was the school secretary, Cheryl. Her tall brown hair stuck out like a sore thumb. She had the same furious scowl as Mrs. Johnson, and Molly was leading her right towards them. "What now, Lincoln?" Clyde inquired. Lincoln looked around desperately for something to use as a weapon. He quickly spotted an indoor flagpole that had a sharp-looking point at the top of it. "Clyde, help me pick up this flag. We're going to use this like a spear." A look of surprise developed on Clyde's face, but he quickly stored it away as he helped Lincoln remove the flag off the stand and hold it so that the sharp point was facing towards Molly and Cheryl. "Charge!" Lincoln shouted. They ran at full speed towards the deranged secretary. They both yelled at Molly to move, and she did just that, diving out of the way as Lincoln and Clyde zoomed past her. The flag skewered the adult right in the stomach as Lincoln and Clyde thrusted it with all their might, but the secretary continued towards them as the pole dug deeper and deeper into her. Lincoln and Clyde continued to push until the pole was poking through her entire body. Lincoln looked as Molly was lying on the ground, staring at them in dazed shock. "Run!" Lincoln yelled at her. That snapped her out of her stupor. Her mouth moved like she was trying to say something, but no words came out. She eventually got up and continued to run as fast as she could. As the grown-up edged closer to them, Lincoln and Clyde began to shift around the teacher in a circular motion. Luckily, the hallway was big enough for them to do this. As soon as they were standing on the opposite side of where they were, Lincoln turned to Clyde and shouted, "Let's go!" They both let go of the pole and ran as fast as they could down the hallway towards the part of the school where the younger kids' classes were. The hallways were stained with blood, while kids' clothes and school supplies cluttered the entire floor. Lincoln prayed that none of the blood belonged to his sisters. They soon reached where the third grade classes resided. Lincoln looked at the door until he saw the name of Lucy's teacher on one of the doors. Just like Mrs. Johnson's classroom, this room was also a wreck. There were chairs and desks that had fallen over, and books and papers were scattered all over the place. The blood on the floor of the room made Lincoln fret. He imagined all the kids clustering around the teacher, and, just like the case with his teacher, the adult getting up and grabbing one of them. What if that poor kid just happened to be Lucy? "Lucy!" he cried. Clyde was about to tell Lincoln to be quiet when they heard a noise coming from the ceiling. Lucy, Lincoln thought to himself. It had to be her in the vents above them. She always spent time in the vents at home, so if anyone would know how to get into the vents at school, it would be her. Lincoln repeated his sister's name, and the sounds of someone shuffling in the ceiling above them came to a halt. "It's me, Lincoln." One of the ceiling tiles moved, and a pale face poked out through the hole. "Lincoln?" said the girl in an uneasy voice. Lincoln breathed a sigh of relief. Lucy was always a person who never really showed much emotion, but Lincoln could tell by the way she said his name that she was very frightened. Lincoln held his arms open. "It's okay, Lucy. I'm here." The dark-haired child hopped down, and Lincoln caught her. "Lincoln," she repeated, her voice cracking. She buried her face in Lincoln's shirt and sobbed silently. Lincoln uttered words of reassurance and asked her if she was okay. She nodded with her head still buried in his chest. "What happened?" Lincoln asked, even though he pretty much knew the answer. "I don't know," Lucy whimpered. "I saw a bright flash from outside the window and then a loud bang. After that, the teacher went psycho and bit down on one of my classmates. All the other kids ran away screaming after he did that. I just sat frozen in my seat as the kid broke free and ran away. Fortunately, the teacher didn't see me as he ran after him. Then I could hear screams coming from out in the hall. I was too scared to go out there, so I unscrewed the screws on the vent and hid in it." She pointed to an opened vent cover. Luckily, she always carried around a screwdriver. Lincoln gave her another hug, and then told her that they had to go find her younger sisters. "I don't want to go out there, Lincoln. There's nothing but pain, misery, and death." "We have to," Lincoln urged her, but she was still too scared to move. "Lucy, please." He continued to tug on her arm until he noticed that her head was facing towards something behind him. Lincoln braced himself for what he was about to see and turned around. There stood Lucy's teacher in the doorway. His face was stained with blood and wore the same furious glare as all the other adults.